this stormy night. This exhibit is the kickoff to our new season. So if you haven't received a catalog yet, please pick one up from the table in the lobby, and you can see all the other great shows that we have lined up for the year. I'm pleased to introduce our visiting artist, Daryl Thetford. Daryl joins us today from Chattanooga, Tennessee. His digital collages are a blend of original photographs and original stories. And in the last 5 years, his work has been in over 20 solo and group exhibits, including shows at the Young Center in Houston and the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to Daryl for traveling to Williamsport. And after his talk, he'll open the floor for questions. So please help me to welcome Daryl Thetford.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This? I thought he was wiring me already. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Penny, and thanks to everyone at the college. Before I talk about the art and about the series and the title and all that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I currently live in Chattanooga, but I grew up in a tiny, small town that in the northwest tip of Tennessee, which was so small that we had a red light, and they took it down because no one stopped. And that's the absolute truth. I was not exposed to art other than maybe through TV shows when I was growing up. But my dad was a warehouse worker and my mother was a beautician. And so, and in my entire area, there really wasn't any art that I ever saw, and no one that I ever saw who made their living in any form. So the word graphic designer and commercial artist, much less a person simply selling paintings, was just a really foreign concept to me. Because, and it actually went further when I actually became a professional artist, and my parents were really in shock about that because I left my professional career. I was visiting them one day, and I had heard on NPR a story about a guy who had spent years building this 50-foot sculpture using 2 cranes, and it was this amalgam of folk art and machine, and it was just sounded amazing. So it was just 30 miles from their house. So I was there visiting them, and I said, "Come, let's go look at this." So I'll go. I take them there, and I realize, and the artist is miraculously, he's actually there working on it still, because he's still working on it last time I was there. And they had not gotten out of the car because they said, "We can see it fine from here." So when I get back in the car, and I'm talking a little bit about how long he's worked on it and this, using these 2 cranes to build this monumental sculpture, my dad said, "It's a shame he's just throwing his life away." And I said, "What could he be doing?" He goes, "Well, he could be salting hams. He could be doing anything but what he's doing." So anyway, so they've been great, but I think it was a bit of a shock. So when I was growing up, not that I was one of these kids who was always painting and drawing and doing something artistic, but I'd really never seen. Since I'd never seen anybody make a living in art, I didn't even understand it could be done. I knew there were things like art majors in college, but I couldn't imagine what one would do with one. So I actually got my bachelor's and then got my master's in counseling psychology and worked in the mental health world and community mental health for 15 years. So I did everything from therapist to start a psychiatric rehabilitation program to manage a mental health center. And one of the last jobs as part of my other responsibilities in mental health after 15 years was to go to the local hospital anytime on Sunday night, anytime they had a person with some form of suicide attempt, which is really stressful and hard to do the night before you start your work week. So I'm doing that one night, and I see this guy, and he had been through this huge family event, and he had done a suicide attempt, and he had been at the hospital for hours with them doing all kinds of things to him. He had had a hard day. So I show up at 1:30 in the morning, he looks at me and he says, "Man, you look like hell." And so that's the moment I knew that I was leaving mental health, when this guy is telling me how bad I look. So the way we made that transition kind of evolved out of my wife, who is also in mental health. Sorry, I keep bringing this farther closer. My wife, who's also in mental health, she and I we'd gotten in the field because we loved it, but we were burnt out. So we met two people who were making their living as artists. And it's like, oh. And they said, well, yeah, this can be done. I mean, you kind of cobble these things together and it's doable. So she was more burnt out and more insistent than me. So she jumped first. And she became a full-time artist and writer, which is what she still is. And I followed her 3 or 4 years later. And that's what we've been doing ever since. So this has been my full-time job for 15 years. So half mental health so far and half art. Let's see, let me grab my notes here. Well, you'd think I'd wear my glasses if I'm going to have notes, but apparently not. Okay, so when I started with art, I started with shooting straight Americana. That was, I was doing just straight photographs, talked my way into a bunch of juke joints in the Mississippi Delta. I took those photographs, I photographed roadside, kind of interesting roadside places, old signs, and from there it evolved into something different, where I was beginning to, since I'm doing it all digitally, one day I had a photograph of a beautiful old brown guitar sign on my screen. And I also had a photograph of this beautiful section of close-up of weathered graffiti. And I thought, I mean, it just kind of passed through my head. I had one of these Reese's peanut butter cups moments where I went, wow, that would look great on there. So I simply did a very simple copy, the graffiti, pasted it onto the guitar, loved it, and thought, well, this may be a new direction. And it was a while before I got there, but that's how that very simple move led to these, which are a whole different story. What I did, let's see, 1 second, I wanted to, I knew I was skipping something, that's why I wanted to look at my notes. Before I get into my process, the full kind of explanation of my process, and talk about some of the pieces individually, what I wanted to talk about was the title. So, the struggle to evolve before the end of time kind of came from a couple of different things. One is the end of time reference, because I wanted this to be both personal and general, so, or universal. So, where the end of time came from was when I was growing up, in this rural, very conservative religious community, I heard people routinely, as they got older, in their 70s, and especially their 80s, talk about the end of the world is coming. And as a kid, that would frighten me, so it made a real impression on me. And I'd ask my mother, no, the end of the world's not coming. So, but it was a pretty common thing to hear. And as I got older, then I would meet people who are atheists and educated, and they would kind of talk about the same thing, only in different language. And not as many of them, but still a significant number, where, oh, you know, it's great financial disaster coming. Oh, there's a great war coming. You know, you better prepare, because we think it's going to be the end of the world. And it's like, wow. And it clicked for me. This is psychological projection. The end of their world is coming. And, you know, but that's not what they're talking about. They're not saying, I'm going to die soon, that the world is going to end, and their world was going to end. So I kind of like that as that both universal, because, you know, I haven't found a way to avoid it yet, but so we're probably all going to face that end of the world. So the struggle to evolve is about, I believe that we are, I believe that we should pursue internal growth all the time. My therapist thanks me for that. And I think that we should always be looking at our motives, what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, our relationships. And so that's that part of evolution. And it's funny, I don't know if anybody will admit to have having seen Interview with a Vampire a few years ago, but it's, the one part that made a real impression on me by this pop movie was you have this great, grander than life vampire who is afraid of nothing. But toward the end of life, toward the end of the movie, we see him huddled in a corner, afraid of the streetlights, and barely surviving on rats because he is terrified of the change in the world. And he's starving to death. And I've seen too many people in my life who are huddled in a corner, starving to death, just taking what little they can get because they have not evolved with both internally or with the culture around them. So that's what this is. So when I was initially thinking about doing it, well, being a person who my first inclination is always to do something in some type of organized fashion, compulsively. So my first thought was I would do this from beginning to end, very neat linear line where we're starting with a young person, we're moving to people in their middle years, we're moving to older people, and we'll have different things that represent that. Art doesn't really lend itself to linear, at least when I do it, and it also neither does our psychological process. So for me, I began to quickly realize if I would just go with the things that were calling to me, it's all part of the same series and all part of the same process, but it's not linear. So that's kind of where this came from. And I took a lesson from when I was used to garden some, and one time I killed an entire group of watermelon vines by trying to make them all grow in a straight line. And so I knew I would probably kill this process by doing the same thing. What I'm doing, to give you a very broad definition or explanation of what I'm doing here, is all of these pieces consist of dozens of photographs that I've taken. I combine them digitally, and I print them on aluminum. Then I put 3 coats of high gloss varnish on those, and that's what you have here. So what I thought I would do because I'll tell people that, and people will nod and go, "Oh yeah, that's I see." But if I break a couple of pieces down and show you exactly what I'm doing, and tell you what each of the pieces are and kind of the thoughts behind it, it'll make a lot more sense. So I'm going to do that for a couple of pieces, and then I'll take your questions, and we'll go from there. So this piece, for example, if you can see this, I'll talk about the inspiration behind it first. So I'm a little bit afraid of heights. And so last year, with the insistence of some friends, I jumped off a 9,500-foot cliff in Sun Valley in a tandem paraglide. I'm a little bit afraid of driving over bridges. So, and for me to put on a parachute and literally run and jump off a cliff was just, so that was the inspiration, because part of the thing for me was they're all doing it, and I don't want, and I truly, the truly aware, conscious part of me knew that this is probably not going to kill me. It just scares me to death. So I'm not going to stand on the ground just because I'm afraid. I'm going to take this jump. But it's not about me. It's about that universal jump that we all take. It's about that psychological leap that we're afraid of, but we do anyway. So the way I put this together is I actually put on a suit. I stood on a big planter because I found that if you have someone pose as though they're jumping, it just looks like a mannequin. So I set the camera up. My wife was willing to stand there and photograph me jumping off of a flower pot, and that's what I did. So that's me. Then the face is a composite of 3 different photographs. One was old vintage photograph that provides the outline of the face. The eyes were actually Andy Warhol's eyes, and the lips were the lips of a mannequin. The water tower was just a water tower I photographed in Chicago. The bridge was in New York. These chairs were gathered around a TV set in a meeting room. All of these lines were part of an astronomy chart just a vintage astronomy chart. The parachute was in a sporting goods store. And all the color you're seeing, from the gold to the orange to the blue, and the boat, and even the boat, which was brown, all the colors come from dozens of photographs of weathered paint. So paint that I photograph on sidewalks, train cars, graffiti, weathered paper on urban poster walls. So most of these will have at least 75 to 100 photographs in them. And most of them will take 40 or 50 hours. And then I do very, very limited edition pieces so that they're not common. So that's how this one came together. This one, I'll just go next door to the one right here. This one's called Man and Cello. And this one began, I actually put part of this one together pretty quickly. I photographed this guy playing a cello on the streets of New York for tips. I don't use too many found images that aren't mine, but in this case, I didn't want to use this gentleman's face. I don't know him. And I borrowed, this is an old vintage public domain photograph of Carl Jung, the psychologist. So it just kind of tickled me for Carl Jung to be playing this cello. I don't know if it would tickle him or not. This mannequin is a composite as well. This is a mannequin's face, and the body and dress is part of an old 1920s hosiery ad. And then it was just a little black and white outline, and I pasted in the color and the texture and the shadows. But once I got those two there, I said, I really like this, but I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what this is. And I like to usually start with an idea. This guy's going to jump. It's a parachute. Here's what's happening. A lot of these started with a very clear idea. This one I wasn't sure what was happening. So anytime I do that, it takes a lot longer. And I started just playing with it and pasting things. So all these are from old signs, no hardball playing. This was in a kids playground. Yes. The phones, TV were part of an old hotel sign. So all these are old signs and weathered paint. And I finally realized what I'm looking at, it's a dialogue. So it's a dialogue between the two of them. It's a dialogue that's internal, and it's a dialogue with the world. And so that is these two. And under here, by the way, is from the poet Iris Murdoch, who essentially said, I'll paraphrase, she said, when you start recognizing people outside of yourself as people and not as objects in your world, then you become more fully human. So the other piece I think I would explain would be one of these two in the back. So I'll say this, if you guys want to look at this one back here. This one's a lot like the Man and Cello in that it's one of the few where, with the Man in the Boat, I knew exactly the idea I was starting with, and I progressed pretty straightforward with this one. With this one, I started with finding a vintage card in Barcelona of this illustrated war scene of World War I that was put out by a chocolate company. I love the energy of it. And I wonder what it would be like to recreate the energy of that card, only not war, and in a contemporary setting. And so that's the idea I started with, but without really knowing where it was going. And pretty clearly it became what I call this piece The Search for Balance. And it really became kind of a meditation on our interaction with career, money, time, the media, as in media we use, And so what you're looking, and our dialogue with each other and our engagement with these things. So you'll see a lot of references to time with these, like these clocks, the sun charts, stock market reports, different photographs of money. And all from the iPads to the laptops, all the devices they're holding have either text from the Art of War, or they have text from the Tao. So representing two different modes of operating in the world. You have some people who are directing, some who are observing, some who are charging, some who are defensive. I don't know what this guy's doing. This guy's sitting and he's just completely withdrawn. So that's a general explanation of kind of the thought process and the process of these pieces. I'll be glad to answer any questions about anything, almost anything.
I loved your stories that you have with them. In particular, the piece in the far right, and you have near the window, about your trip that you took, and with your friend who was more free-spirited. It was just, and you're a really good writer, and I really enjoyed reading everything about that.
Thank you. There are two people who write that. I write it, and then I rewrite it, and then I rewrite it. And then I hand it to my wife, who's a writer, to finish that writing. And that's why they're so good. You know, that's why it's so neat. And she'll say, "Why are you using all these words?" So, but thank you.
I love how honest you are about your own, quirkiness, and, as we all should be. And so it comes out in a lot of your art as well.
Well, it's a funny thing. I wasn't always that way. I was pretty rigid and controlled and guarded, and would rather no one know anything about me at all. Especially when I was in my 20s. And my wife, who's in the black shirt right there, she writes essays, and she writes for the newspaper, and she does all this writing. And so what I found pretty rapidly is if you do it in front of her, it goes into the newspaper. And so, and she would tell stories about, you wouldn't believe what Daryl did last night. It's like, oh my God, I would never, no one would ever know this. So I learned pretty rapidly to tell on myself before, so I could put my own spin on it before she could. And it was a healthy and good thing for me. But I don't know if without her, because that was her. She's open about her stuff, and she puts it out there. So she trained me to put it out there like that. I'll say, I guess the one last story, if no one else has any questions. The guy watching the TVs in the far corner is, that's based on an old story called Ignoring the Door. And in the story, there's a man locked in a cell who looks up at a little window, and he wonders what his world would be like outside the cell. He wonders what it's like out there. It's if things were different. And the thing is, in the story, you find if he would explore the dark part of the cell, he would realize his door has been unlocked all the time. So this is a contemporary, my version of a contemporary version of that. And so I created a collage for each of the TVs. And so he's invested in TV and culture and media, and maybe not doing the psychological work he needs to do. You have a question?
Well, that actually led to a question I was formulating ahead of time. Because you have a background in psychology, you may know Martin Seligman, famous psychologist, president of APA.
Okay.
Started out doing all this research on learned helplessness. And then he switched about 20 years ago. And now he's into learned happiness. And he's really moving in a direction of saying we spend too much time, other people have done this, too much time looking at failings, shortcomings,
Right.
and not looking at potential. And so here's the question. You have a lot of bright colors, and given your bio, your background, you were working with, as people in that field will, you're working with a lot of desperate and poorly functioning folk.
Right.
Even though you have themes that could potentially be dark, everything is very bright. And I'm thinking, is there a parallel there? Is your thinking parallel to your own career shift? Are you looking more favorably and positively in contrast to the description of the kind of end of days thinking that you referred in your intro?
Right.
Or are you positive? I guess these look positive to me. Maybe because of, not just because of the color, but there's always somebody looking up, which seems to me very different than looking down.
Right, right. No, I think it's a great question, and I think you're kind of right on it. I don't think that I don't think that exploration has to. I mean, we have to deal with some things. I believe we have to deal with some things in order to move past some things, but we don't have to live there all the time. And I think that there is a new world out there, a different world, a brighter world, if we're willing to do that, and then move on and look and see. Because I think there's a lot to that movement, where people are, working with, how do I move forward versus how do I look back all the time. So, yeah, and for me, they weren't meant to be dark, brooding pieces. They were meant to be contemplative, but yeah, overall, something that you can live with, something that I can look at this, I can think about this, I can live with this, I can ponder this without it being some statement of darkness or, desperation.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think it's interesting what Tom brought up, because as I was looking at this piece here, which is titled Man in Dark Woods, my first thought when I looked at the title was, it doesn't seem dark to me. It seems bright. And, the title would have you think, this is going to be a scary picture, and it's not.
It's taken out of the first paragraph of Dante's Inferno, and or my paraphrase of it, and my vision of it. Because while it's a scary journey, it's ultimately a positive journey, and he's starting down this journey that will ultimately free him.
Can you talk about the designing of this particular painting? How you go about putting together the various elements?
I could.
They work as images. So
Yeah, I think, if I understand the question, and correct me if I don't, when I'm working with a lot of images, I love to have a strong central focal point, like the guy pulling the bulb here, the guy in the chair. Things like this are so much more complicated for me anyway, because there are so many elements, and to keep it balanced. So, for me, I start out with, overall, I start out with the placement of the people that I'm photographing. So all these people are either friends or artists I know, or different people who I've photographed in different positions, literally posing them in different positions. And then I start putting them in, and I'll find that I have too many or too few, and I'll start experimenting with taking them out and moving them around. And and with this particular piece, it was almost done, but not quite working. And I couldn't figure out why. And I finally, it's a little bit different proportion than the rest of the pieces, and that's because I cropped about 6 inches off the bottom and 6 inches off the top, and went, oh yeah, that's it. So that was the difference. I actually had to pull that border that I have there, that was actually on the bottom. So what I did is I literally pulled that up and then cut the 6 inches off. But so for me, that's the way I work anyway, is I start putting them in when I feel like the people are more or less balanced, then how do we make the rest of this work? And I start going from there. I usually have a pretty clear idea of the colors I'm going to use, and sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't. I've gotten in there and realized, wow, that looks awful. I don't need to do this. It doesn't work with the mood or anything else. But that's and this one too, I had to finding that balance of busy versus not overwhelming. And you know, for me, this looks like the way my mind works. It's kind of filled with stuff running in every direction, but I'll have to watch that it doesn't get so busy that it's you know, for some it would be, but I can get to a point where it just becomes a muddy mess, really. So that's the other balance I have to keep an eye on.
I had a question about Tennessee. You said you grew up in Tennessee and it was conservative, and you still live in Tennessee now,
Right.
right? Do you feel with the, you know, with the changes of time, is your work embraced in your home area of Tennessee? Being that it's a little bit wild?
No, it's not. I don't sell any work in the South. I think there are a lot of people who have no idea I do artwork. So it's, I don't have a gallery in Chattanooga who represents me. I have one gallery in Tennessee, and she's in Nashville, and she does do well mainly with corporations and tourists and a handful of others. But no, it's, you know, my dad really had the perfect quote for this. He said, "Why would anybody buy this?" And so that was, to me, that was the perfect, that represented the Southern male thinking about my art. And I've had it in different places where people have seen it, and it's amazing the difference if I am in Maryland or California or Chicago, or if I'm in the South, because it's a completely different reception. It's, you know, I mean, there are a lot of positive things there, but the art does not translate for most.
I would think in Nashville would definitely have that point. The reason I thought about that was a friend of mine who had been an art professor at Mansfield University, which is just an hour above here, never felt accepted in this area with his art. And when he moved to Olympia, Washington, Seattle, you know, has sold lots of work, and he just feels like, wow, they get me there. So
Right,
I was
right.
just curious if your fellow Tennesseans get you.
Yeah, no.
Well, thank you, Daryl.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.